Well, good morning, everyone, and good morning to you, Paul. How are you?
I'm quite well, thank you. And yourself?
I'm doing excellent. I'm really excited to have you here with me today and to get good insight into the SAG Basic Agreement based off of all of your years of experience. I'm Cameron Woodward. It's a pleasure to meet all of you that are attending today. I'm one of the co-founders here at Wrapbook. I was a commercial producer for a number of years, as well as deeply integrated in kind of production insurance and production operations, which then led me on the journey of building out the Wrapbook platform alongside over 200 plus amazing rappers trying to build an elegant and beautiful solution for you. Lauren, if you wouldn't mind going to the next screen, I'd love to introduce our awesome guest today. This is joining me, Paul Schoeman, who has 25 years of labor relations experience, has worked at a number of different entertainment payroll companies, and also really impressively at SAG-AFTRA as well, and has just an incredible depth of knowledge of all things unions, especially on the SAG side. Today, we're going to be really digging into the SAG Basic Agreement, in spite of the fact of there being many different types of agreements. But before we go there, I wanted to give a brief introduction as to who we are here at Wrapbook. Wrapbook is a seamless, smart, and secure solution for entertainment payroll. We serve companies of all different sizes, companies that are recurringly producing content, as well as for producers who are doing one-off projects. If you go to the next slide, I really wanted to highlight that what we're doing is really transforming the industry through software by connecting accounting teams, production staff, cast and crew with a number of different types of software solutions that make the process of payroll really seamless, beautiful, and integrated. And so for many people, when they use Wrapbook, they find themselves using the software for managing the full stack of their production organization with kind of payroll right at the center. And with payroll and entertainment comes oftentimes payments to unions. And that's why we've built out an absolutely world-class labor relations team at Wrapbook. So Paul's here joining us today, and we're really excited to dig in with you, Paul, about the basic. But I wanted to highlight some of the awesome team members that also work with us here at Wrapbook and who are available as resources for Wrapbook clients. So we've got Lon, Steve, and Patrick. You can read here some of these amazing contributors' background and their experience in labor relations at Wrapbook. And I just wanted to kind of set that framework and foundation for any of you that, as you kind of think about your next projects or working with Wrapbook, we have not just amazing software that you get to engage with, but also an unbelievable support labor relations team and success team at your fingertips as well. And with that, Paul, let's dig into the meat and potatoes. What in the heck is a union signatory, and what is the basic? Why do we have to start there?
Well, the simplest, to answer the easy question first, a signatory is when a producer signs an agreement with a union, binding them to that agreement. There are various groups, the IATSE, which covers your crew, the Teamsters, you're mostly the drivers, but also locations, and as well as casting, writers and directors, but today we're talking about the talent. So I'm going to start with the basic agreement. And I want to do that with a little bit of history. The basic agreement is a confusing term because you'll hear that the IATSE have a basic agreement. DGA has a basic agreement. Well, SAG also has a basic agreement. In this context, let's go back to the start for just a moment, just to give you a little context of where it came from. In the 1930s, the actors were represented by AFRA for radio, but nobody for the visual arts other than stage. A number of actors got together, and in 1933, they decided to get a union going for screen actors, became the Screen Actors Guild. They got the first contract in 1937. That contract became and has evolved into what we now call the basic. So, just as a visual reference, many of you may have seen a hard copy of the basic. This is the most recent print version of the basic. It's about 850 pages. However, it didn't start like that. It started a little bit smaller. This is the 37, 38, I believe, if those of you can see it. How did we get from this to that behemoth? It's a long story. That's not the topic for this discussion. I'd be happy to talk to you about it, but it's a long and interesting story. And I believe that one of the things that Cameron wanted me to mention on this was, in the history of this, is just as a piece of trivia, the relationship to the basic agreement and a famous politician, Ronald Reagan. Most people are familiar with Ronald Reagan from his years in US politics. What a lot of people don't realize, other than he was an actor, he was also the president of the Screen Actors Guild for some years in the 1960s. Of interest to why I mention his name particularly is he did take SAG out on a strike. It was actually the most aggressive strike, one could argue, that got them the biggest gains they'd ever seen. And so there were three big things that Reagan brought to the table that you will all recognize. The first one is meal penalties. They had meal penalties before, but the meal penalties negotiated were so good, they're the same ones that exist today at the same rates. They far exceed all the other locals, and anybody who's had to pay them realizes how steep they can be. The second component was critical to the membership, the creation of the pension and health plan in 1960. He laid out the framework for the initial funding with his group of negotiators, and it still exists to this day. It's considered one of the best parts of being a union member. The other part, which is key to the membership, is residuals, payments for reuse of the product. A lot of actors, and also its own interesting, complicated story, but just to scratch the surface, a lot of actors said, hey, I worked on that film and they paid me and they're still making money off of it. Why aren't I making money off of this too? So we now have residuals, and the formulas and the methodology behind calculating them are insanely complex. There's no easy way to put it.
Paul, you mentioned to me the other day that, in theory, there are many, many, many different types of contracts at SAG-AFTRA. Why should a producer start with the basic, understand the concepts of the basic, and how does that kind of relate to somebody, either starting up a project or engaging in the activity of multiple productions throughout a year? What is the basics like bones, and why is it called that, and why do we start there?
Well, the basic agreement is what I always call, it's the backbone or the spine to so much of what SAG does in the contract world. There are a couple of key contracts. Most of you have probably heard of the basic and the commercial agreement. The basic was the first, and it lays out terms for how you pay and treat actors, from everything from overtime through basic minimum compensation and payments that would eventually be owed them for the reuse of the material they helped create. So what the union did is they started off with, as I've mentioned, this little tiny book, and it started to grow. Well, eventually this other thing came on called television. That resulted in a television agreement. There was a cable agreement, and there are many, many SAG agreements to this day, in the hundreds, believe this or not, because there's many small facilities, radio stations, broadcasts that might have a SAG or legacy AFTRA contract. The basic, what is significant about it? It is where we've laid out all the language that specifies pension and health contributions, which are owed in every single one but one SAG agreement. It also lays out the basic framework for daily and weekly employment for special types of categories, such as dancers, singers, stunt performers, or even background performers. Each one is broken apart. So what I wanted to do was talk about how that agreement kind of carves this apart to make it more bite-sized, because almost every other agreement you ever will look at for SAG somehow ties back to the basic, which is why I refer to it as the backbone. So I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
Yeah. So let's dig in and you were mentioning, speaking of these different components and what a producer should understand, take us through it.
Absolutely. So in the basic agreement, when you look at it, it is overwhelming. It's a massive document. And to make it worse, a lot of the language is very dated. It came into the agreement in the 1930s, 40s, 50s. It makes reference to a sleeper cabin, on a train, a berth on a ship as a method of transport, leftover language that we don't really use anymore. However, let's get into what is important. The front of the book talks about basic things such as travel insurance if you're flying a performer, and it talks about the administration of the pension and health plan. As a producer, you won't usually have to worry about that, but you will have to worry about the percentages and such. However, that's all located in the basic. What is interesting after that is we start carving the performers into different groups. And so the basic is essentially carved into schedules, which are alphabetical. We don't cover every letter of the alphabet, but a good portion of them. And essentially they start with the letter A. What is the letter A for? It is a daily performer. A letter B is a form of weekly. A C is a slightly better compensated form of weekly. And I'm making some very broad generalizations, so please forgive me. However, as we go through, you will find that there are schedules that are specific for dancers, singers, stunt people. So those are schedule breaks. And so, well, now I've mentioned there's different schedules for a performer that's weekly. What's the difference? Well, as I mentioned, A is a day player. That is something you're going to use when you want to hire a performer, be it famous or first job ever, for a day. They're going to come in and they're going to recite a few lines and hit their marks, do their thing. But now you're doing a show, you're doing a theatrical. Maybe you want that person for 4 or 5 days. They want to be weekly. You're going to make them into a next schedule. You're going to make them into maybe a schedule C. If they're a star, they might be a schedule F. What is the difference? Well, there are two main terms that come to mind. There's schedule breaks and money breaks. And to really address those, they're a little complex. I'm going to make some very basic statements about them. So I'm going to start with schedule breaks. The breaks are based off of a couple of categories. They're based off of initially performer, such as your A's, B's, and C's, your dailies and weeklies. Well, what's the difference between a B and a C? Well, the schedules vary by there's certain components that will trigger from one schedule to a next. The amount of compensation. So for example, the schedule F is a lot of compensation as opposed to a schedule C weekly. Both are weeklies. And the concept is the more money you get, the higher up the schedule you go. Then it reverts. Then you go back to your stunt performers. You have a daily stunt schedule. You have a weekly stunt schedule. You have a stunt coordinator, and so on and so forth. What's different is then you have money breaks. Well, aren't they the same thing? And there's a lot of confusion. The difference is a little tricky, but money breaks are breaks that occur inside of the schedules. So when you're inside of a particular schedule, if you are paying the lowest possible amount of money, you're paying a lot of terms and conditions for overtime, meal penalties, rest invasions, and such. As you give the performer more money, the producer gets more breaks. Essentially, they get relief because they are now compensating those performers in a more generous fashion. So they're giving a bit more, they get a bit more. That is essentially the basic concept of a money break. And these get truncated a lot. You'll hear people say daily, you'll hear people say they're on schedule A, it means the same thing. Now, this all ties into all of the other agreements. And there are many. I'm only really going to try to get into the low budgets a little bit at this point, because again, there were still a lot of questions. I'm going to try to touch on a lot of them, as many as I can, but a lot of them, the answers become very complex. So
Okay,
before I dive in, I'm sorry, go ahead, please, Cameron.
Yeah, so just to I'm trying to take this all in. I'm sure our audiences as well. So correct me if I'm wrong. So we have the SAG-AFTRA. They have lots of different contracts, but the core scaffolding that builds all of those different agreements is the SAG Basic. The SAG Basic has a lot of different sorts of components. Now, were you calling those components schedules? Is that correct?
Yeah, essentially, yeah. The schedules, the vast majority of the SAG Basic is a differentiation of schedules. So there'll be about 60, 70 pages on a day player, a Schedule A. How many hours are they guaranteed? What type of overtime do they get? And so on. And then the
Right.
Schedule B and so on, and they build progressively. So about 90% of that book is schedules. And then there's a section one on the front and a section in the back that have other areas that they specify and they drill into.
So if I'm a producer and I've like crewed up my cast, do I have to then kind of consider the tasks and the work that my actors are going to do and then try to combine it to the schedule in the basic to figure out, you know, how to then apply a money break or the conditions of the contract? How would I kind of manage that as a producer?
Well, a schedule break, if you were full basic, and I'm going to be kind of jumping out of scope a little bit here, is at first it's self-explanatory, which is I'm going to hire you, Cameron, to come in and say, run, Rambo, run. I'm going to hire you as a day player. I just need you for this Friday to show up and do that one line. But you know what? I need you for a whole bunch of shots. I'm going to bring you in as a weekly. I get more bang for the buck as a producer. You get more guarantee of employment as a performer. So it's kind of, I like to think of it as a win-win. There are ways it can be abused by either side. I don't want to go into that, but that is essentially how it's broken apart. But it's essential to understand that to go into the low budgets, because low budgets, while they talk about schedules, essentially simplify it in favor for the producer. So low budget agreements allow you to have much reduced payments. So depending on how low the low budget agreement you go, usually have a percentage of what the rate would be from the basic. It might be 20%, it might be 50%, but it's giving you the benefit of you are a small up and coming producer. You need this financial relief. So the low budget agreements are driven by budget. The smaller your budget, the more concessions you essentially get. The low budget agreements are really, the way I've always described it, is they are concessions to the basic. So you, the low budget producer, are saying, I agree to the basic, but I don't have that much money. So the low budget agreement says we are taking that as a union into consideration, and we will waive a bunch of these terms or set aside or reduce your requirements as a producer to make it more palatable for you to use.
That's great. I mean, and we'll get into some of these concessions a little bit further on related to these other contracts that are still like from the basic, but they've been altered to kind of work with producers as they're growing in their projects and in their own careers. So, okay, so we have the big basic, we have schedules, we figure out according to our production where our cast fits into the schedules. And then there's money breaks within the schedules themselves, within the actual contract document. Would you restate for all of us, like, what is a money break and kind of how we should think about them as producers?
Yeah, the money breaks essentially, okay, so inside of a schedule break, you will frequently have a money break. And the money break will say, if the performer is making below this threshold, they get a certain, let's suppose it's a penalty or a bump. Maybe it's for a fitting wardrobe. There's a lot of potentials. If you are paying more than that threshold, but less than the schedule break, so you are inside of, say, a Schedule C, but you're paying more than the minimum, but still not quite the total, the ceiling, then you get some of those money breaks, which become beneficial to you as a producer, because again, the theory is you are giving the individual more money, henceforth you are getting more concessions. That's the kind of the core concept that drives it, if that makes sense.
That's so helpful. Yeah, thank you, Paul. You know, when we told the world that we were going to be doing this session with you, this was a major question. Like, hey, what the heck is the difference between schedules and money breaks? And on the next slide, there's this other theme that people really wanted some understanding from you. Can you describe, like, what is the difference between daily, weekly, and then, like, from that, let's answer this question together. Can you go from a daily to a weekly schedule?
That's a great question. So usually, as I was mentioning, the criteria is a pragmatic one, which is how long do you need the performer from? Now, there are daily schedules for a standard performer. You can hire a stunt performer, has a daily schedule. There are pretty much most of the classifications you can bring on is daily. For your main performers, for your stunt people, you can also hire them as weekly. And again, it's the concept is you're giving them more, but you're giving them a bigger period of guarantee. They don't have to go look for the next job as much. So it's a kind of a win-win. Can you go from the daily to a weekly? Without getting into the weeds of exactly how to do it, you can generally go from a daily to a weekly. However, you usually can't go from a weekly to a daily. The mantra that a lot of people use is you can go from small to big, but you can't go from the big to the small. So you can upgrade from the daily, but you're not ever really supposed to go from a weekly back to a daily. Now, this does tie into the low budget agreements, however, because the low budget agreements don't really, it's kind of hard to articulate, but they almost don't recognize weekly as a schedule. They talk about daily performers because the original core's concept of this agreement was you're going to have a small shooting schedule. You have such cut rates. They're planning on you using your performers as daily. So it's not really wrapping in the weekly concepts that you get with the basic. You can do it, but it's usually we're used to seeing those people push through as daily performers.
And so again, going to, no pun intended, going back just to the absolute basics for some of the audience members that may be here, and apologies for those of you that are more senior or experienced, but a daily or weekly schedule, like these are two different ways to pay an actor, right? Like what's the designation?
I'm sorry, when you say designation, I don't know, I understood.
Well, let me reframe it from a question that was asked before we jumped on, which is, what are the best circumstances to utilize a weekly payment rate plan with an actor versus a day rate?
If you are going to be utilizing the performer for more than just a few days, specifically at least a week, low budget, low budgets are not really designed around travel and distant, and they are certainly not allowed on international because the theory is you don't have any money. With a regular non-low budget, you very well may be on location, international, and so on. You would probably want to get into a weekly schedule. The weekly is you are locking in that performer. You are getting them for a period of greater time. For continuity, for filming, you don't want to have a performer who's going to be available today and, yeah, I'll be available next month. You can't have that for production reasons. And so if they are a primary character in the film that's recurring, you are generally going to want to bring them on as a weekly if you are under a contract that allows for that. It gives you more benefits. It gets you more work hours, more bang for your buck, essentially.
That's great. Now, there are some awesome questions starting to pop up, and just for all of you asking them, keep them coming. Towards the second half of our webinar, we'll address as many of them as possible. So Paul, you were speaking to this idea. So like, hey, I hired someone for a day as a day player. Hold on a second. Wait a second. We've made some changes. We want you on a weekly basis. Does a production need to file any particular forms with SAG-AFTRA to officially denote that change, or can you kind of describe that process?
SAG does need to be, well, you're going to be sending copies of the paperwork to SAG. So yes, you will be notifying them that there will be a change of schedule for that performer. And it would also be reflected on your normal reports that you'll be submitting, such as your Gs and other stuff that you'll be sending in. You'll be reflecting that that person is maybe now a Schedule C, has been upgraded, that they have refilled out a new piece of paperwork, and you're going to resubmit that paperwork. Yeah, usually a star form or related documentation that they've signed off that their performer is agreeing to any sort of changes.
Okay, awesome. So there's a really good question kind of related to the daily and weekly that I wanted to ask. So somebody says, do weekly contracts mandate consecutive days? In other words, can I hire someone October 1, 2, 5, 9, 11, and 15 and still have it be weekly? Or how do we kind of figure that out?
I would like to get into that, but That would be its own hour-long session. That's we're in drop pickup and consecutive employment. It's that is a little bit, I think, too complex for me to try to get into and articulate at this point.
Awesome. That sounds great. So, for some of these types of questions, if a company is working with Wrapbook, they would then have access to the labor relations team to kind of like drill in and create strategies for how to kind of.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the type of question we would be answering all the time for folks. Myself or Lon or some of our payroll team are phenomenal. They are also extremely well versed with this contract and can also assist. So yeah, that is the type of question, because it's not just a black and white question. There will be subtleties that will need to be asked, like days of week, what was established already, the shooting schedule. It's not going to be a very cookie cutter answer. There's almost every question will result in more questions to get you the correct answer, but we can get to the correct answer.
Awesome. Here's a couple more, and maybe the same answer is like, hey, come talk to us, but I'll throw these out there because I think that they're relevant to this section. So if you hire someone as a daily, do you make them sign the daily contract every day they're on set, or just once for the rest of your project?
As I recall, once you've signed on as a daily on your start paperwork, you basically agreed that this is it for your days, and you're filling out time cards after that. Your start should be your one-time event, unless you're having some sort of redo that you're coming back as a daily stunt performer or something like that. Or if you were, say, you were a background performer and someone fell in love with your performance and they want to give you a line and upgrade you to a day performer, you would then fill out a new start form as a day player.
Okay, awesome. That makes a lot of sense. And then along these lines as well, another question: for the rates listed as weekly on the rate cards, is that for 5 8-hour days?
For which contract?
For I guess the basic.
Basic, no. Basic is going to be all over the place. You're usually looking at week guarantees, like a 44-hour week and so on. There's no real clean, easy answer to that one. There's also variance between studio and overnight and things of that nature.
Very, very good. Okay. Let's move right along here into the SAG-AFTRA low budget agreements. You had some interesting points that basically our basic contract is the meat and potatoes. It's the spine of how these agreements even work as well. But then there are some concessions or some changes to how these contracts work to facilitate like a robust production industry for all types of budgets and producers. Do you want to kind of just jump through these and kind of describe what they are as how they would relate to our audience? And for all of you in the audience, I'm watching questions and answers as well. So as you have questions, please submit them and I'll ask Paul here.
Yeah, I will try to answer this on a high level. So again, I expect there will be detailed questions, and my apologies. I could go down massive rabbit holes with any one of these. So I'm trying to keep myself focused on this. So the lowest budget films are truly, those agreements are really not meant for distribution, because I noticed there were quite a few questions from a week ago about selling or modifying some of these agreements. Really, the smallest is, and to answer, there's a couple of questions on this, which was, someone had asked, was there a agreement under which no pension and health is owed? Oddly enough, there is one, which is the micro budget, which I think is either cuts off a $20,000 or $25,000 budget. That agreement has almost no terms and conditions. And to answer the question that everybody then asks, which is, why does it exist? If you are a SAG member, you're not supposed to work what we call off card. You're not supposed to do non-union work. So if Cameron is a SAG member and he wants to do up a small little film with some friends, so he has something for a demo reel, for agents, for interviews, this allows him to work under a SAG contract without violating his membership that he's only going to be working on a signatory. However, that agreement does not require any terms, conditions, or pension and health, because you have no money. So That is the reason that weird little agreement exists. After that, they all start kicking in terms and conditions. So when you look at the ultra budget, it's under 300,000 or less. The scale rate is not a whole lot. It's very bare bones. And when you pick up that agreement and you look at what part of the basic does apply, it will usually tell you in that agreement. And it will be things that they don't want to bother to relist because it exists. It's easier just to say, for the purposes of grievance and arbitration, please see the language in the basic. For nudity provisions, please see the language in the basic, rather than arbitrarily inserting 2, 3, 4 pages of language into what's otherwise a 2, 3 page agreement. And so each notch up, so when you go to the moderate low budget, they're going to incorporate a few more items, and progressively, the bigger the budget, the more terms from the basic you'll start to see. And so that is kind of the normal, is that basically the more money you have, the less willing the union is going to be generous, as you would expect. So eventually all of these agreements do in some way tie back to the basic. Most evident is usually pension and health. Most of these agreements will say, please see the specific articles in the basic for pension and health contributions, cutoffs, and amounts. But that is essentially where the low budget logic comes from. And additionally, somebody had asked a question about, can you release theatrically under a ULB or a micro low budget? I do not recall which one from the top of my head, but those production levels were never intended to be used for release, for theatrical release. They were considered to be very modest budgets. And so a lot of times, if you're talking about release, especially with the tiniest budgets, you have to reapproach the union and say, I think this is going to be the Blair Witch success level. I want to try to sell it theatrically. You may have to go back and re-sign with a different contract that has different provisions that will allow for that release. Another anomaly that's worth noting is for ultra low budget, 300,000 and under, there are a lot of questions about Taft-Hartleying. You can Taft-Hartley under a ultra low budget. The big difference that a lot of you may want to note is a Taft-Hartley performance of an actor on a ULB or lower may not be usable for membership if they are trying to join. Now, why would you think that this is, again, a question that comes up, well, why would anybody prevent that? It's because, let's suppose Cameron and I want to get into SAG. Well, we could make a $30,000 production. We pay each other. We cut each other checks after the fact. We both get Taft-Hartley. We both get in the union. We're successes. It's to prevent defraudment of the union for people trying to get in by making their own, hey, I got a barn. Let's make a movie. So.
Super interesting. There are so many questions, Paul. It's awesome. We'll really be able to jump into these. I had one that just came to my mind though. So in many ways, you describe these as like concessions to the basic. Here's a question: if the union wants to change one of these contracts that we're showing here, the lower budget agreements, do they first make a change to the basic and then make a change to these agreements, or do they ever make changes to these agreements and then these agreements inform how the basic evolves over time?
That's an extremely good question. I'm going to answer it a little bit backwards.
Okay.
The one thing that they negotiate in the low budget agreement that they rely on the basic for is pension and health. That is negotiated for years. When they do the basic, the low budget tie into the pension and health rate from the basic. Boom. There is a reason for that. I will not bore you with it because it is a long answer, but that is the one main provision that leaps to mind. There's a few others like arbitration and things that will probably come up. The low budget agreement, okay, so the basic, the big 800-page behemoth, is jointly negotiated between the producers, represented by the AMPTP, and the union. Happens every 3 years. They get together. Takes a couple of months generally. hopefully they come to a peaceable agreement. There's increases in terms and conditions. Ta-da! The low budget agreements are not jointly negotiated with the producers. The low budget agreements are individually owned by the union. They are union owned agreements, which, by the way, technically the basic is owned by the union. However, the low budget agreements are created by the union. It is a committee that is comprised of staff members and volunteers who are members. Get together every couple of months. What do you think of this? Oh, we should incorporate this new technology. There's a new camera, there's a new medium, there's a new this. Should we change the scales? And, sometimes they'll say, no, everything is good. Sometimes they'll say, you know what? We need to increase the scale for background performers, or we need to put in an increase in the wardrobe or whatever. So these agreements, as a piece of trivia for those who've been doing this for a while, you might remember that the low budget agreement did not have incremental increases to the scale rates. About every 4 or 5 years, they would just arbitrarily increase by 30 or 40%. About 4 or 5 years ago at SAG, we changed that. So now it's usually a percentage of the basic, so you can budget on it. Because before that was problematic. Low budget producers hated that they were getting a outsized increase every few years without warning. So normally these agreements, when a change is coming, SAG tries to post it on the website and they try to spread the information that a change will be coming in advance, but they're not supposed to change it on you midstream. If you've signed up to an agreement, they're not supposed to come in and say, oh, we said 379 was the day rate, it's now 380. Once you're locked in, you're supposed to be locked in. So they're not supposed to monkey with you like that. And I believe that the union's usually very good about that. So.
That's extremely helpful. Before we move into just general Q&A, Paul, is there any other comments or questions that maybe I didn't ask you that you think we should really touch on related to the low budget agreements?
Low budget, not so much. There was one easy question, just to divert for just a second. Someone had asked, what happens if I'm ultra low budget and the union shows up and wants me to become a union signatory? Usually, without going down a huge rabbit hole, if it's just the performers union, SAG would ask you, and the part of the question was, what contract will they sign you to? That's relative to what you're producing. If you are making a student film, you're going to be ultra low budget. You're going to be under one of the appropriate low budget agreements. If you are making a show for a streamer, you're probably going to end up with a new media agreement. So it's all relative to what you are producing in the budget level. And and this will vary when you get into other unions. I'm very specifically talking about SAG. So I think that's really about it for the low budget stuff, though.
That's awesome. Well, let's dig into the Q&A. The people here want to ask you questions, Paul. So let's dig into it. We'll just try to answer these live. So Joanna asks, is there no scenario for hourly paid workers? If a SAG actor was only needed for 2 hours, would the day rate have to be used?
For live performance on camera, the normal response is there's a day rate. Hourly rates are generally not something you see under the theatrical or television agreements. Are there some weird exceptions? Yeah. There are occasions where there are derivative amounts and things where you have prorated partial days or 4-hour schedules, such as additional dialogue recording, where you might have a short, you're not going to be walloped with an 8-hour, you're going to get a 4-hour or less. There are also other contracts outside of this realm which have different parameters, such as animation and things like that, where your normal production cycle does not involve physical camera, physical photography, and has different lengths of days.
Awesome. Thank you. Here was a question that came in from folks before we were live here on the webinar. Can you describe the schedule of what forms or paperwork are required and when during the phases of production?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of paperwork. And the paperwork will vary production by production. I don't have a really good guide or cheat sheet to that. It starts off with basic information about the company, your financial creation, making sure it's a legitimate company. Well, that's to say, SAG wants to make sure that Cameron isn't making Cameron's big movie so that Cameron can get into SAG as a member, that Cameron's big movie actually has a backer, is a real entity. And so there's paperwork like that. There's a trust document for the pension and health plans that you have to fill out that says, I'm a real entity and I will make contributions based off of the rules and regulations of the plan. There's other information that is all relative to the production. When is it going to happen? Where is it going to happen? The actors, precast list, the final cast list, your exhibit G. And so there's just a ton of paperwork. There's no easy way of condensing it. I wish I could be more refined on my answer on that, but I'm afraid I will go down a 2-hour-long rabbit hole of paperwork.
It sounds like a good topic for the Wrapbook editorial team to kind of tackle on our blog. That's awesome. Thank you, Paul. Let's see here. Here's a question. You had mentioned this a little bit ago, and I think you mentioned that the answer is tricky, but what are voice actors considered for a podcast series? Do you know any thoughts on podcasts, how it relates to the basic and just
That's a great question. And just for the person specifically who asked that, I actually did further digging because that was a moving target. And the response in combination with what I kind of knew already was, it's going to be different on a case-by-case basis, which is not the answer you wanted. I was told it was going to, at the moment, it could be new media. It could actually fall under different variation. It could be signed as it could be a social influencer agreement if the person is doing podcasts as a social influencer. It could be a number of ones. And so the formal response I got was, it will be case by case when you ask them, depending on the variables. I think that they will go pretty easily with you, just because I believe SAG is attempting to get social influencers and podcasts more rolled into what they represent. So they definitely take the position that they're covered, but there's not really, as of last Friday, there was not a black and white answer on that.
Awesome. Extremely helpful. Here was a really good question I'm curious to hear from you on. Do SAG-AFTRA agreements cover North America or just the US? Or like, what's the geographic considerations on the basic and the other contracts?
That's a big question, globally speaking. Is the SAG contract really only has jurisdiction in the United States, its territories, protectorates, and so on. However, so, okay, scenario one, you're going to make a movie and you're filming in the United States, $10 million feature, you're SAG, done. So what happens about, I'm going to make a movie in Bulgaria? So the way that SAG deals with this is that they have something called Global Rule 1. That is also slang termed GR1 by most of us. What that means is a member says, I as a member promised SAG that I will not work as an actor on a film or appropriate project without SAG representation, without a SAG contract being in place. So that means I can go to Bulgaria and star in a film if that film signs with SAG. Now, I may be the only SAG actor on that film. They have to treat me as SAG. But it does not mean that they then have to cast all SAG performers and bring them from the United States. If they hire Bulgarian nationals, that's outside of SAG's jurisdiction. Now, if they want to pay that Bulgarian performer as a SAG actor in US dollars, it changes the dynamic. But normally they are saying it's GR1. Simple example, I was doing labor relations at another payroll company for a DreamWorks production with Tom Hanks. that had to go to Germany. While he was in the US, he was paid SAG, no issue. The film then went to Germany for a few months. While he was in Germany, we paid him per SAG, but technically it was under GR1 that the production had agreed that they would pay him per the SAG rules, even though that the production was physically located at that time in Germany. So does that make sense, I hope?
I think it does. And I think you addressed a number of questions that were coming up specifically on that rule. Here's a question that just came in, Paul, that I really love as a producer who's always swinging for the fences, trying to get my work seen and profitably consumed. David asks, if a project is produced under an ultra low micro agreement and is released on YouTube and then miraculously makes some money, what happens?
That is the way it's supposed to happen is the producer is supposed to reapproach the union and say that this film, which was not originally intended for monetization, has become, and I just always like to pick on it, Blair Witch. It's unexpectedly gone very big. They at that point will say, well, we want you to re-sign a different contract, and they will have a conversation. And part of that conversation will become, so where exactly are you putting this in the theater? Oh, someone from that streaming service saw it and they want to stream it. And they offered me a bunch of money. The union will then try to figure out, well, is it an outright sale? Are you going to be monetizing it through streaming? So you're getting banner ads, so it's ad supported. How do we get that monetization to the performers? So there's not really a clear cookie cutter answer as how you would do it, but that they do understand that now that what was not going to be monetized will be generating revenue. The performers who were part of it should be receiving either maybe retroactive compensation or some sort of residual. That will be variable. It's going to depend on how are you monetizing it? Where's it being monetized?
That actually fits perfectly into another question, because when we were talking about the geographic considerations of where the contract covers, somebody asked is like, okay, you are under a SAG agreement, you shoot it in the US, that's great, but then you distribute it, let's say in Canada, or let's say in some other international market, it produces revenues, is it the same story? Like you should, in theory, be going back to the union and disclosing the impact of the content? Like, what's that look like?
In theory, yeah, you're always supposed to, because if you are selling it internationally, you're still generating revenue off of it. There's a desire to know that, yes, it is being monetized so that they can also keep their records. SAG likes to keep records of who was in what and when, because things happen all the times where a good example was there were a lot of shows that we kept poor records on at SAG that no one thought would ever re-air on TV. They eventually did with streaming services. Now these things air all the time. Now they have to make residual payments and such. The union would like to have records of what was shown, where it was shown, when it was shown, so that they can calculate and do all those payments correctly. So yeah, there are if you are, even though if it was filmed in the US, if you're trying to still monetize it in another country, SAG would want to know. They may not do anything. If it's going to depend on the budget, how much was the compensation initially. One extreme would be the low budget that does really well, and you make a lot of money distributing it overseas, versus a foreign production comes here, hires an A-lister, does a couple of days to get a marquee name, and then distributes it in a foreign country without ever releasing it here. I don't know that SAG would really be getting involved with that at that point.
Really, really helpful. Thank you, Paul. Here's changing direction just a slight bit. Is somebody asked, can you explain hold days? How does that apply to like a day player, a weekly player? When does it apply? Is there a payment for it? Do you have any general insight into hold days, what they are, how they work?
Well, other than the actual term itself, I don't really have a clean explanation for that one. Not
Okay.
one that's not one that I can do quickly, because I know our clock is ticking. And if I start going down that rabbit hole, I think the remaining time will disappear in a heartbeat. I'd be happy to take that on, but not within the time constraint we have.
I will reiterate that to our audience. I think, Paul, you are making such a strong case with your incredible knowledge as to why an amazing labor relations department is so valuable and why we're so proud and delighted to have you and the labor relations team at Wrapbook, right? Because in addition to the software, these types of questions need to be planned out and need to be thought through so that producers can be smart, productive, and above board in how they conduct their production operations. So I really want to thank you for that. And we can sneak in a few more. This one I thought was really interesting because I know that this is important to producers. I'm trying to kind of bias questions towards producers. So if you're determining your budget, right, and you need to figure out how to engage with SAG, how do you think about it in relation to soft money? Example, Georgia tax credit or a jurisdictional production incentive. Like, do I need to include the total budget for SAG's purposes? Can I exclude those can I exclude those incentive dollars? Like, do you happen to know an answer to that?
That one I'd have to check, because I know with tax incentives, there was a bit of oscillate. I don't remember where SAG landed on it, if that was allowed or not in the budget. I know that usually each union has a list of things that they will allow or disallow, like a contingency budget, things of that nature. With SAG, I would need to go and verify that. I'm not certain what they are looking at for inclusion or not on that at the moment.
Awesome. Thank you. Shameless Wrapbook product plug. Our amazing product team recently rolled out the ability for us to withhold taxes on loan outs in the state of Georgia for producers filming there and looking to take advantage of the state's tax credit program. So definitely reach out to the Wrapbook sales team if you're going to be shooting in Georgia. We'd love to kind of talk with you and get a sense of your production. Let's see here. Here's one. Are SAG actors paid full days for travel days versus being paid at 0.5 for travel days? Do you have any insight on travel days for actors?
That's a very specific question.
Yeah, okay.
I would say that's one I would take later or offline, just because it depends on the length of travel, where they're traveling, which agreement. There's a lot of variables. Almost any answer I give would be both correct and incorrect at the same time.
A quantum answer. Perfect. I love it. Here's one. Are day rates on the basic agreement 8-hour or 12-hour rates or something else? Do you know?
It depends. Are we talking? Yeah, well, with the basic, I'm going to. I don't want to do it in the service. It depends on which schedule you're looking at, because there are multiple daily rates and there's background performers, and I'm kind of flying dark on that one. Without, again, be happy to answer, but a little more detail if I could get it would help me to get the exact answer.
Okay, Paul, let me ask you this. So we've had a couple of questions that seem very oriented to an individual question asker's own project. Here's a question that I am curious to get your answer on. For the Wrapbook labor relations team, if we decide like, hey, we want to work with Wrapbook, we got a demo, they can take on my project, I'm going to schedule a meeting with Paul and the labor team, what details should a producer have with them ready to go to bring to your team so that you guys could have a conversation about how to proceed and how to be strategic and thoughtful about succeeding with not only the basic agreement, all of the other agreements, and maybe even the other union agreements as well?
That one is not as bad as you would think. That is, not in order, but these all will be the factors. When is the project going to occur? Where will the project occur? What type of project is it? Is it meant for theatrical? Is it an episodic TV show? Is it going to Netflix? Is it a documentary? It could be any. Need to know exactly what type. What is the budget or budget per episode if it is broken apart into episodes? Then there's a bunch of other sub questions. Usually the answers to that will help me start to feel out where I'll take the questions with a client, because I'll want to know, oh, you're shooting in California. What part? inside the zone, outside the zone, this location, that location. In the case of California, depending what part of the state will impact, certain things with the IA and studio teachers and such. And so I will kind of, as you get past those initial 4 or 5 questions, I can start to delineate what you may want to know. Because if you tell me I'm going to be filming next August and I'm going to be filming in Atlanta, okay, well, then I'm going to say, well, what type of project? What's your budget? Okay, well, you tell me that. I'm going to say, well, what do you need to know? Are you looking at doing a budget? Probably at this point, you're doing a preliminary budget. You're going to want scale rates, fringes, what unions, what contract, what is the overtime provision for extra Y? And those questions, those become very interesting, long conversations that are usually very fruitful because the questions start to steer you in, oh, okay, this is what you're trying to achieve. You're going to do 2 weeks here, 6 weeks there. And we can always answer those questions. But I just need the actual details: where, when, budget, what is it, who's it going to be sold to?
Awesome. Let me sneak in one more for you because I've seen a number of these kind of pop up. It's really around the signatory process. So somebody wants to know, if my company becomes SAG-AFTRA signatory, can my company do non-union projects as well? Or like, what are the guardrails or the processes of becoming signatory? What can I then do if I become signatory? What can I then not do? And I guess I would just call out, like, I guess that would depend on the purpose of your business, right? Like if you're a production company doing multiple productions versus just a single LLC or stood up for the purposes of making a film. But any thoughts or details generally about the signatory process, what it enables you to do, what it maybe keeps you from doing in the future?
Yeah, the normal rule is if a company, a production, if Cameron Production Inc. signs with SAG, the expectation is you are SAG. You should not be doing non-union productions unless it is some sort of not covered work, which is a pretty small arena. But normally, once you've signed to a union, you are with that union. To get out of that contract, both parties have to then terminate the agreement if you were to go down that path, and that normally doesn't happen. So if you think of a major studio like a Paramount is signatory to SAG. Paramount does not have to re-sign with SAG every single time. Same with all the other unions. There is a notification. Essentially, all the studios will tell the unions, Paramount is making Star Trek 29. That's one of ours. Just to minimize confusion, you let everybody know what you're making, who the entity is. If you are doing a one-off production, if you are making Cameron's Big Adventure and it is a sole company and you create it, you sign with it, you're done with it. Once that project is done, completed, on the shelf, and you close that company down, then that's it. But most of the time, when you sign with a union, if it's a production entity, you are stuck with that union. So going non-union is usually not an option for whatever group you signed with. So if you sign with actors, you're going to be using union actors.
That's fantastic. Well, look, from my experience being a producer, the membership of SAG-AFTRA really, truly are absolutely unbelievable performers. And I've always enjoyed working with the talent there. So signing with SAG-AFTRA and engaging with their membership has, in my experience, been wonderful. So that's super helpful, Paul. Moving on to the next screen, I want to just highlight a few things for those of you that are watching. Wrapbook, we spend all of our time thinking about how to build absolutely stunningly easy to use and sophisticated technology to enable you to be better producers. But in the spirit of that, we also spend a tremendous amount of time building tools and educational resources and doing webinars, because alongside our product, we also want our marketing to be additive to your life as a producer and in the project economy. To that point, we built this really cool tool that I wanted to teach you about really quickly. It's the SAG-AFTRA Agreement Finder. This is a really neat tool that's available for anyone to access. If you go onto our website, you click resources, you'll see it, the Agreement Finder. It'll ask you questions about your project. It'll ask you questions like your budget, where it's going to be, who's in it, all of the questions that may help you get an understanding of what contract you're on so that you can then dig in and budget and get a sense of what it's going to take to make your project fly. From there, should you decide to work with us at Wrapbook, obviously you have this amazing resource in the labor relations department, but this is an available tool that I would really encourage you all to check out. It's extremely helpful. The other thing is, we did not get to all of your questions, and we really just talked about the basics. And we talked a little bit about the subset of contracts that come from there. If you've enjoyed this session, or if you have additional questions, please reach out to us at the Wrapbook marketing team or tweet at us. We are delighted to answer your questions and engage with this community. As well, if you liked this, let us know. We can bring Paul on or some of the other experts to talk about other contracts or other specificity within the different contracts that the unions have. And then lastly, this webinar is recorded. We will be sending it out for those of you who want to reference it later. On Wrapbook's website, we also have an events portal. So you will be able to see a number of different webinars that are coming up across all different types of topics, from product launches, changes to the industry, et cetera, et cetera. Overall, I just want to thank you all for your time, your wonderful questions. Paul, thank you so much. We're so lucky to have you here with us at Wrapbook. And for all of you, we'll see you next time.